Some countries appear rich, but one shock could collapse everything. Oil, exports, or debt. Overdependence hides risks no one notices until it's too late. Jobs vanish, prices spike, savings shrink. What seems distant suddenly touches daily life everywhere. Some nations rely on one product, one market, or one debt system. When it falters, shockwaves spread globally. How do these dependencies work? Why do they threaten stability? Let's start with the countries that depend too much on a single resource. Understanding overdependence is the first step to seeing how hidden risks shape the world's economies. Overdependence happens when a nation relies too much on one resource, export, or debt. Small shocks ripple instantly, exposing invisible fragility hidden beneath apparent wealth and growth. Saudi Arabia depends heavily on oil revenue. Price drops strain budgets, disrupt programs, and force rapid government adjustments. Dependence on a single product creates structural vulnerability. Vietnam relies on electronics exports and global supply chains. Shifts in international demand immediately affect factories, jobs, and growth, linking domestic stability to external markets. Brazil depends on commodities like soy and iron. Market swings impact currency, employment, and government revenue. Single product reliance amplifies the effect of global fluctuations on everyday life. Debt-dependent nations like Greece face rising borrowing costs. Government programs shrink, social support falters, and economic flexibility disappears. Overdependence is not always visible until crisis. Jobs, wages, and opportunities fluctuate with external shocks. Households experience uncertainty in costs and employment. Governments juggle revenue, trade, and debt, leaving little room for error. History shows overdependence repeatedly triggers crises. Sudden shocks ripple through economies reliant on single resources, exports, or debt. Vulnerability grows silently until markets and societies feel the strain. The 1970s oil shocks hit Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and other exporters. Price swings destabilized budgets, delayed development projects, and forced wage reductions, showing the cost of resource reliance. Latin America faced debt crises in the 1980s. Greece, Brazil, and Mexico borrowed heavily. Rising interest rates caused contraction, exposing over-reliance on foreign capital for growth. Countries dependent on a single product or revenue stream endured painful austerity and structural adjustment. Diversification proved critical to reduce the amplification of shocks on society. Lessons persist today. Nations failing to diversify face amplified instability. South Korea's manufacturing variety reduces shock impact, highlighting how spreading income sources builds resilience. Dependence magnifies economic and social stress. Jobs, inflation, and opportunities fluctuate. Governments must act proactively, learning from history to prepare for modern, interconnected vulnerabilities. Modern dependence shapes economies and global competition. Relying heavily on one product or sector exposes nations to sudden shocks, impacting growth, stability, and social confidence instantly. Saudi Arabia depends on oil revenue. Price drops directly affect government spending, social programs, and sovereign funds, making public finance extremely sensitive to global fluctuations. Vietnam's economy relies on electronics exports. Factory shutdowns, shipping delays, or lower international demand ripple through wages, employment, and GDP, showing dependence on global markets. Brazil's commodities like soy, iron, and oil dominate trade and revenue. Price swings affect currency, fiscal balance, and social programs, linking everyday life to global markets. Even financial dependence matters. Greece remains sensitive to borrowing costs. Rising interest rates or debt pressures constrain governments, limiting spending, programs, and economic flexibility. Overdependence attracts external leverage. Sanctions, policy changes, or foreign demand shocks cascade through systems. Diversification, domestic resilience, and strategic management reduce vulnerability and strengthen long-term stability. Overdependence creates pressure that spreads across entire systems. A single shock does not stay isolated. It moves through production, finance, government decisions, and daily life. When oil prices fall, Saudi Arabia faces revenue shortages. Government programs tighten, investment slows, and long-term projects pause as fiscal stability comes under strain. Vietnam experiences factory slowdowns when electronics exports weaken. Employment dips, local businesses suffer, and household income becomes vulnerable to distant market decisions. Brazil feels commodity price swings immediately. Currency volatility rises, inflation pressures households, and trade balances weaken, linking global markets directly to domestic stability. Debt-heavy countries like Greece face rising interest costs. Governments impose austerity, delay infrastructure, and reduce social spending as financial pressure tightens. Pressure cascades like chains, resource to production, government to households, markets to confidence. Overdependence amplifies shocks, forcing reactive policy instead of strategic control. Overdependence reaches people faster than statistics. When systems strain, citizens feel it first through wages, prices, and uncertainty long before governments respond effectively. When oil prices drop, Saudi Arabia sees public wages slow, subsidies tighten, and dependent industries reduce hiring, increasing pressure on households reliant on state-linked employment. Vietnam's electronics slowdown causes factory layoffs, reduced overtime, and unstable incomes. Entire communities feel strain as export demand determines local job security. Brazil experiences job insecurity in agriculture and mining. Commodity volatility raises food, energy, and transport costs, pushing everyday expenses higher for families. Debt-dependent countries like Greece face higher taxes and reduced social services. Households absorb the shock immediately as public support shrinks under financial pressure. Overdependence turns economic weakness into social stress. Confidence erodes, opportunity narrows, and instability spreads faster than recovery, making diversification a human necessity. Countries counter overdependence with diversification, strategic funds, and long-term planning. These measures reduce vulnerability, strengthen resilience, and ensure shocks do not cascade uncontrollably through economies and society. Saudi Arabia invests in Vision 2030, expanding tourism, technology, and renewable energy. Shifting revenue sources decreases reliance on oil while preparing new growth sectors for the future. Brazil diversifies trade, developing agriculture, mining, and industry. Reducing dependence on a few commodities spreads risk and shields government income from sudden global market swings. Vietnam upgrades domestic factories and encourages high-value exports alongside electronics. Industrial modernization increases flexibility, reducing shock impact while building capacity for long-term economic growth. Sovereign wealth funds stabilize budgets during revenue drops. Policy tools like tax adjustments, subsidies, and incentives cushion households, maintain capital flow, and protect employment. Diversification is gradual. Infrastructure, skills, and partnerships take years. Foresight, coordination, and adaptation transform risk into resilience, turning overdependence from vulnerability into strategic advantage. Overdependence spreads beyond borders. Saudi oil price drops disrupt global energy markets, causing inflation, trade shifts, and economic stress in dependent nations worldwide. Vietnam's electronics export slowdown impacts US, Japan, and Europe, delaying technology supply chains, affecting factories, jobs, and international production schedules. Brazil's commodity swings influence currency stability, global food prices, and trade contracts. International markets respond, showing how local dependence creates worldwide ripple effects. Countries reliant on exports face foreign policy shifts, sanctions, or demand drops. Fragile economies transmit external shocks, amplifying risk across finance, trade, and logistics networks. Investors track vulnerabilities. Capital reallocates toward stable nations, increasing pressure on dependent economies. Overdependence influences alliances, investment flows, and global trade strategies, shaping international relations. Nations with diverse exports, stable reserves, and domestic production absorb shocks, reinforcing global confidence. Fragility in one country can trigger international instability and economic crises. Overdependence teaches vital lessons. Hidden risks are real. Countries relying on a single product, export, or debt source face amplified shocks when external conditions change. Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, Brazil, and Greece show how dependence magnifies economic and social strain. Small disruptions quickly ripple through jobs, wages, and government programs. Diversification spreads risk across industries, exports, and trade partners. Strategic reserves, sovereign wealth funds, and domestic production reduce systemic pressure and protect citizens from shocks. Adaptation is slow, requiring infrastructure, skills, and global integration. Policymakers must focus on continuity and risk management, not short-term gains or temporary revenue spikes. Overdependence reveals global vulnerability. One country's shock affects partners, supply chains, and markets. Stability in one economy reinforces confidence elsewhere. Fragility propagates crises internationally.